In the fall of 1934, as the warm days of summer slowly faded into the crisp breath of autumn, a newlywed couple ventured into the wilderness of Wyoming, seeking not only adventure, but perhaps a quiet beginning to their new life together. Their names were Carl and Olga Mauger. Just weeks earlier, they had exchanged vows and promised each other forever. But forever came to a sudden halt when, in the blink of an eye, 21-year-old Olga Mauger vanished into the vast silence of the Togwotee Pass mountains. She was never seen again. Olga was no ordinary young woman. Born Olga Schultz on March 11, 1913, in the small town of Lead, South Dakota, she was the daughter of German-Russian immigrants who had settled in the American heartland. She grew up learning the rugged ways of frontier life, hunting, trapping, hiking. Her family later moved to Fremont County, Wyoming, where she grew into a tough and self-reliant woman, comfortable in the wild. Friends and family often describe her as kind, lively, and capable, a person who knew her way around the wilderness better than most men of her time. She wasn't someone who would simply get lost. Her life changed swiftly in the summer of 1934, when she met Carl Mauger, a man who worked in the booming oil industry of Wyoming. Carl had been in a long-term relationship with another woman, Ella Chack, but when he met Olga at a local dance, everything shifted. Within a few weeks, he had broken things off with Ella and proposed to Olga. They married on August 25, 1934. Some in the community thought the marriage was rushed. Even Olga's own sister, Edith, recalled that Olga had seemed somewhat hesitant, even sad, in the days before the wedding. But no one expected what was to come. Just 2 weeks after their wedding, the couple set off on what was supposed to be a hunting honeymoon. They headed toward Togwotee Pass, a breathtaking stretch of mountain wilderness between Jackson and Du Bois, Wyoming. Olga was excited to revisit the place. She had trapped in those hills before and knew the terrain like the back of her hand. For Carl, it was more about the thrill of elk hunting. They arrived at a campsite known as Engel's Camp and set up near what is now the Togwotee Mountain Lodge. On the morning of September 17th, the two set out on foot into the highlands. Olga packed sandwiches and carried a small hatchet. She wore sturdy boots, a gray sweater, and a green felt hat. Carl carried the hunting rifle. Hours passed as they hiked through dense trees and sloping hills. Around mid-afternoon, Carl suggested they climb a ridge to scout for elk, but Olga said she was too tired. She told him she'd wait by a large rock while he went ahead. The spot was near a logging road, close enough that she could hear passing trucks. Carl later said he was gone for about 20 to 30 minutes. When he returned, Olga was gone. At first, he assumed she might have gone for a short walk or stepped into the trees to relieve herself. He called her name, circled the area, then retraced their trail, thinking she may have gotten bored, and decided to walk back to camp. But as the minutes turned into hours and the sun began to set behind the mountains, Carl's concern deepened into panic. By nightfall, Olga was still missing. Carl alerted authorities the next morning, and within hours, a massive search effort was underway. More than 300 people joined the hunt for Olga Mauger. Forest rangers, expert trackers, civilian conservation corps workers, even locals with their own dogs. The terrain was searched foot by foot, but no footprints were found. No clothing, no items from her bag, not even a sandwich wrapper. It was as if she had evaporated into the forest air. What confused everyone was that Olga wasn't a city girl unfamiliar with the outdoors. She was a seasoned hiker and trapper. If anyone could survive or find her way back, it was her. Rumors quickly spread. Some whispered that perhaps Carl knew more than he was saying. After all, it was strange that he had left his new bride alone in the wild. Stranger still was how quickly the search failed to yield any clues. But Carl insisted he had nothing to hide. He repeated his story countless times, and investigators could find no evidence of foul play. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clothing snagged on bushes. Just emptiness. Olga's family was devastated. Her father and sister traveled to the site, clinging to hope. Edith, her older sister, found herself plagued with unanswered questions. She remembered how Olga had looked before the wedding, quiet, almost regretful. Had she married Carl too quickly? Had she changed her mind? Some theorized that maybe she used the trip as a way to escape, a way to start over. After all, she had $30 in her pocket, a fair sum in 1934, and she was close to a road. Could she have hitched a ride with a passing truck? But that theory didn't explain why she would have done so without ever contacting her family again. The weeks turned into months. Snow began to fall in the mountains, covering whatever traces might have been left behind. Eventually, the search was called off. With no body, no witnesses, and no evidence, the case faded into quiet coldness. Carl eventually remarried. Yes, to Ella Chack, the woman he had left to marry Olga. That raised some eyebrows, but it happened 7 years later, and again, there was no proof of wrongdoing. Over the decades, Olga's case was remembered as a sad, strange mystery, a haunting question mark in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness. It became the state's oldest unsolved missing person case. As the years passed, more stories would circulate. Sightings, rumors, theories. But the truth, what really happened to Olga Mauger that September day, remained out of reach, just like Olga herself. And so the mountains kept their secret, holding tight the silence that began on that crisp afternoon in 1934, when a young bride vanished forever. Time passed, but the pain never dulled. For Olga Mauger's family, every quiet night echoed with questions. Every letter that never came, every knock at the door that wasn't her, carved deeper into the ache of not knowing. In those first few weeks after she vanished, hope flickered like a fragile candle. Perhaps she was injured, but alive. Perhaps she'd wandered further than expected and was waiting to be found. But as September turned to October, and snowflakes began to fall on Togwotee Pass, that hope began to die. Carl, her husband, stayed in the spotlight during those early days, talking to newspapers, cooperating with searchers, and insisting again and again that Olga's disappearance was just as much a mystery to him. But whispers swirled quietly in the background. People couldn't help but wonder, why would a seasoned outdoorswoman vanish so quickly in broad daylight near a roadway? And why had Carl left her alone, barely a week into their marriage? To Carl's credit, he never avoided questions, at least not in the beginning. He told authorities that he and Olga had started out early, hiked together for hours, and when she grew tired, he continued alone while she sat near the trail. He said he could hear the sound of cars passing on the nearby road from where he left her. When he returned 20 or 30 minutes later, she was gone. Just gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, not even disturbed pine needles. Searchers combed every inch of that mountain. More than 300 people, locals, officials, and volunteers, fanned out, combing ravines, digging through brush, wading through icy creeks. Dogs were brought in. Planes flew overhead. The Civilian Conservation Corps, a group of young men stationed in the area to work on federal land, searched tirelessly. But no tracks, no broken branches, no belongings. The small hatchet she was carrying was never found. Neither was the green felt tam o'shanter she wore. It was like she'd been plucked off the earth by unseen hands. The newspapers followed the story closely at first. Pretty bride vanishes in Wyoming mountains. The headlines read. Articles focused on the romance, the quick marriage, the sudden honeymoon, the haunting mystery. But as the weeks dragged on with no new developments, the headlines grew smaller, tucked deeper into the pages. Carl returned home alone, his wife's name now a question rather than a promise. Life, for everyone else, slowly moved on. But not for Edith, Olga's sister. She never truly believed that her sister had just gotten lost. Not Olga, not in a place she knew so well. Years later, Edith would speak of a conversation she had with Olga just before the wedding. She remembered Olga saying, "I don't really want to marry him, but I gave my word." That stuck in Edith's memory like a splinter. She couldn't shake the feeling that Olga may have felt trapped, and that maybe, just maybe, something darker had happened up there in the woods. There were other odd details, too. Carl had originally been in a relationship with another woman, Ella Chack. Their relationship had been serious. Some even said Ella believed she and Carl would marry. But within just a few weeks of meeting Olga, Carl had dropped Ella and married Olga instead. And yet, after Olga vanished, Carl eventually found his way back to Ella. In 1941, 7 years after Olga's disappearance, Carl and Ella were married. People talked. What had really happened up there? But no one could prove anything. Carl never changed his story. No evidence tied him or anyone else to foul play. The authorities didn't charge him with anything. In fact, they never charged anyone. The official explanation remained missing, presumed dead, perhaps fallen into a hidden ravine, perhaps eaten by animals. But the complete lack of physical evidence, no blood, no shredded clothing, no scattered items, troubled everyone involved. Over the years, stories began to spread. Some were rooted in the ordinary, others drifted into the strange. One story claimed a hunter had seen a woman matching Olga's description months after she disappeared, walking along a back road near the Idaho border. Another rumor said Olga had boarded a freight truck headed for the Pacific Northwest, seeking to start a new life far from Wyoming. Could she have faked her own disappearance? Was she escaping a marriage she regretted? But those theories didn't sit right with those who knew her best. Olga had no history of running away. She was deeply connected to her family, especially her sister. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word, and if she had escaped, why wouldn't she have written? Why wouldn't she have left a clue? Some people thought maybe something had happened between Olga and Carl during the trip, an argument, a moment of anger. But again, no proof. In later years, some local folklorists began to see Olga's disappearance as something more than a simple case. They spoke of the Togwotee region's eerie silence, its isolation. Strange stories were told by hunters and trappers. People getting lost in places they knew well, sudden changes in weather, odd sounds at night. Superstitions began to grow, whispering that the mountains themselves acclaimed Olga, swallowed her into their ancient depths. The years marched on. Carl lived a long life. He eventually passed away in 1992. No confession ever came. No deathbed revelations. He rarely spoke of Olga in his later years. And if he carried any secrets, they went with him to the grave. As for Ella, she never commented publicly on the matter either. She lived out her days quietly, far from the swirl of speculation. But Olga's story didn't die. In fact, it grew. In the 2000s, her case was revisited by writers and investigators who were fascinated by cold cases. In 2008, author Linda Womack published a detailed account of the disappearance in her book Colorado's Historic Mountain Passes, highlighting the bizarre nature of Olga's case. Local historians also kept the story alive, seeing it as part of Wyoming's darker past, an unsolved mystery tucked into the folds of its beautiful but unforgiving landscape. And then, in a twist that few expected, Olga's story became part of a bigger movement. In 2010, over 75 years after she vanished, Olga Mauger's name was officially entered into NAMAS, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. Her case, long dormant, was given new digital life. Her photo, her physical description, and her story became available to investigators across the country. Cold case specialists began asking new questions. Was there any chance Olga had survived for a time? Could she have started over under a different name? Was it possible to match her with any unidentified remains? Even decades later, her family held on to a sliver of hope. Hope that maybe a clue would surface, that maybe a hiker would stumble upon something left behind, or that science might finally offer answers that the 1930s could not. But in the absence of truth, only shadows remain. As the forests regrow and the seasons turn, Olga's story drifts on the wind, carried to the trees of Togwotee Pass like a whispered warning. Don't wander far. Don't trust too quickly. Don't assume the wilderness gives up its secrets. Olga Mauger was a young woman at the start of her life. She walked into the woods with a man who said he loved her. She never came out. And almost a century later, we're still asking the same question. What happened to a bride who vanished into the mountains? Years turned into decades, and yet the silence surrounding Olga Mauger's disappearance never faded. It lingered like a fog over the Togwotee Pass, always there, but never fully understood. By the 1950s, Olga's name had become more of a ghost story in local circles than a true case. Hikers sometimes left small tokens near the place she vanished. Flowers, carved initials in tree bark, even handwritten notes. People didn't forget. They just didn't know what else to do. What made Olga's case so haunting wasn't just the fact that she vanished. It was how completely she seemed to be erased. In nearly all disappearances, something is left behind. Footprints, a dropped scarf, a broken watch. But in Olga's case, the earth seemed to close in around her like she had never been there at all. No scent trail, no torn clothing, not even a rusted piece of her hiking gear. Nothing. In the years following, the Mauger and Plagans families quietly tried to preserve her memory. There were rumors that her sister Edith had hired a private investigator in the 1940s to look into Carl's activities around the time of the disappearance. But those findings, if they existed, were never made public. People close to the case remained cautious. They feared the truth, whatever it was, might have been too ugly to face or too difficult to prove. Over time, several theories began to rise to the surface again and again. Some were built on facts, others on speculation, but all had one thing in common. They tried to answer the impossible question: what really happened to Olga Mauger? One of the earliest and most persistent theories was that Olga had simply fallen, slipped while exploring, perhaps descending into a hidden crevice or sinkhole that searchers overlooked. But search and rescue veterans disagreed. The terrain near the road where she was last seen wasn't overly steep, and it had been searched repeatedly by hundreds of people. The idea that her body and every trace of her could vanish in that short window of time was hard to believe. Another theory suggested that Olga had suffered a sudden mental episode, disorientation, a fugue state, or even voluntary disappearance. But by all accounts, Olga was of sound mind. She had no history of mental illness, and she was said to be happy to start her new life, even if she had quiet doubts about her hasty marriage. And then, of course, there was Carl. As years passed and more pieces of Carl's past came to light, the public reception of him grew increasingly complicated. While never charged with any wrongdoing, many found aspects of his behavior troubling. His quick return to Ella Chack, his former girlfriend, whom he married just a few years after Olga's disappearance, cast a long shadow. Some questioned whether he had ever truly loved Olga at all. There were also inconsistencies in Carl's story. His timing never quite matched up. At first, he said he was gone for about 30 minutes. Later, he told another searcher it was closer to an hour. If he had simply gone on a short hike, while Olga rested near the road, how could she have vanished without a sound or sign? Years later, one of the searchers reportedly said that Carl never appeared to be genuinely distressed. He looked tired, not scared, the man recalled. Like someone who had just finished a long day of chores, not someone whose wife had just disappeared. Still, none of this amounted to evidence. And Carl was careful. He maintained the same story until the day he died. He never remarried after Ella. He never slipped, never confessed. He simply went on with his life, a man forever tied to a question mark he refused to explain. Modern investigators, decades later, took another approach. They began to re-examine Carl's military service. He had once been a member of the National Guard. Could he have known the wilderness well enough to hide a body with precision? Could he have let Olga away from the road under the pretense of showing her a scenic view, and then done the unthinkable? In more recent years, cold case experts brought in forensic tools that had never existed in the 1930s: ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, advanced mapping software. But the land had changed. Trees had grown, trails had shifted, and any physical trace that might once have existed had long since vanished beneath snow, soil, and time. In 2014, a renewed push to bring attention to Olga's case resulted in her being listed as one of the oldest active missing person cases in Wyoming. Her story was added to a national database of cold cases. Bloggers, podcasters, and amateur sleuths picked up the mystery again. Some believe that with enough awareness, someone, maybe a descendant, a neighbor, an old friend, might come forward with new information, but no one ever did. One haunting possibility still remains: that Olga never made it to the trail at all. Some have speculated that Carl may have harmed her somewhere else and staged a hiking story to provide an alibi. It would explain the total lack of evidence in the area. But again, this theory has no proof. Just a trail of what-ifs lined up like bones in the snow. And then there are those who believe in something more otherworldly: the wilderness, they say, has its own rules. Native legends speak of places where people disappear, never to be found, spirits that guard ancient lands, portals that open without warning. Perhaps Olga wandered into one of those spaces. If you believe in that kind of thing, these stories might seem far-fetched, but in the absence of answers, the mind goes to dark and strange places. And Olga's disappearance is just enough eerie silence surrounding it to fuel such imaginations. Today, nearly a century later, Olga Mauger's story remains a chilling reminder of how quickly someone can vanish and how deeply those left behind are affected. Her family never truly recovered. Her sister Edith kept Olga's belongings for years, unwilling to accept her death without a body. The Mauger name faded from the headlines, but not from the hearts of those who knew her. And so we come to the end of this haunting tale, but not to its resolution. Olga Mauger's disappearance is still open, still unexplained, a closed door that may never reopen. Here's a real photo of Olga, young, smiling, full of life, just days before her honeymoon ended in mystery. Her image, now frozen in time, is all we have left of her. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel AI Alvanis, where we bring you real stories of the world's most mysterious and unsolved cases. Who knows? Maybe one day, a viewer like you will help solve a mystery that has haunted us for generations. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.